what I'd like to do is to just take some time to talk with you through the Book of the Covenant. The reason is because when we come to this, it is material that's very strange to us. It's a kind of material that people use as ammunition to speak against us often. They turn to some of these random passages and then judge and criticize. And a lot of it has to do with the ignorance that they have in the way these passages should be understood, and the also the life and times of ancient Israel, the context in which they were living, the opportunities, values, and circumstances that were around them. And what I'd like to do is just as quick as I can look at some of these laws and give a little bit of a background and help you understand them. Now, there's a lot here and I don't want this to be too long, and so we'll just do our best with what we're able to do. The first is one of the most misunderstood of the laws, because the term Hebrew slave is used, and the problem is as soon as we hear that word slave, it fills us with all sorts of understandings, most of which are not relevant to this passage, because what's going on here is not slavery in the conventional sense that we see on movies or may be aware of in our understanding of the southern states of the United States during that period of slavery, or images we've seen from Hollywood of slavery in the past. But rather it's talking about what we could call debt servitude. So really what this is about is a system in ancient Israel where if you were owed money or you were owed stuff, then that was protected. So let's say, for example, often it was not money, it was seed or animals or some other kind of thing. Let's just imagine that there was a family over the hill and different valley. They fell on hard times because maybe they were not getting the same kind of rainfall, their crops were not growing, and over a few years you loaned them seed grain, and repeatedly they had bad harvests, and therefore they got into debt. Now, you in good faith had loaned them that. How was your loan protected? And the way it was protected was whereby they, maybe one of their sons or one of their daughters or someone from their family would come to you and for 7 years would work without wages to pay off the debt. Now, we know that there's an expectation that that debt slave, if we could, let's call them that for want of a better term, or debt servant, the expectation was that they would be treated well, because in verse 5 it says that they may have come into such a good relationship with their master that they actually want to stay there. Maybe they've got married, maybe they have a family, and what they want to do is stay there. And so there was a system, basically this is a system whereby a debt could be paid off. But the second point is that that debt could never go on and on forever. In other words, the maximum time a person would serve to pay off a debt was 6 years, because in the 7th year they would go away debt free. And so, friend, this is actually a marvelous system whereby the man or the family that lends, their loan is protected, On the other side, the person who took the loan, who was in debt, they had a responsibility to pay back that debt, but they were also protected because that debt could never go on beyond 6 years. And at the end of that 6 years, they went away debt-free. Now, as I say, the expectation is that they would be treated well. And if they did want to be a bond servant of that person, there is a ceremony, you read it in verse 6, where they would go to the doorpost. And what that is talking about is that they would make that commitment in the presence of a priest, and the ceremony was they would have their ear pierced. And that was to make sure that if someone was going to become a bondservant for life, then they were doing it freely, and there was no coercion on the part of the owner of the property. And so remember, these laws are given. They're given to protect the vulnerable. And you're vulnerable if you make a loan and don't get it back. You're vulnerable if you're in debt and that debt is never removed. And what this does is it protects different parties in this different way. Now, when it comes to chapter 21, verse 7, a man sells his daughter as a slave. That sounds so bad if we look at it through our 21st century eyes. But we need to understand that marriages were arranged. That was a fact of life back then, and even in some countries now, that often happens. And I'm told by some of my friends in India that arranged marriages turn out to be the best marriages, rather than what they would call love marriages. And so marriages were arranged, and in the custom of ancient Israel, the husband-to-be would pay a bride price to the father of the bride, and then the father of the bride would give his daughter a dowry, and that would be hers. It would always remain hers, and that would be kind of a protection for her. But this sort of arrangement was just simply part of life. And if a man gave his daughter to the man he owed money to, then that would be in lieu of the bride price. In other words, the debt would be cleared because of the daughter being given as a wife. Now, the language, of course, here is if a man sells his daughter as a slave, then, of course, she shall not go out as the male slaves do. And the reason for that would be that she would be married. And the selling of her, it sounds awful to us, doesn't it? But basically, it would be in lieu of the bride price. But then there's a protection that if the man doesn't like his wife, then she's protected, because he has no right then to sell her on as a slave to someone else, but rather she should go free, and therefore she has a protection too. She is given in marriage a new husband. He doesn't like her, and then he has no right to then treat her kind of like property. The young woman is not sold or not given as a wife to the man, but for the son. And if that's the case, she's not to be treated as a slave, but rather as a daughter. And if, as was one of the customs of polygamy, if this man then was to take a second wife, again you see how This woman is to be protected. She is not to have any of her rights diminished with food or clothing or marital rights of the first wife. And if he fails in any of these things, she's protected because she can go out without debt, without payment of money. In other words, the debt that was owing, that she was given as a bride to cover, would be cleared. She is not to be owned by this man, but rather, if he doesn't treat her well, if there's abuse, physical abuse or emotional abuse, mental abuse of the kind suggested here, she is free to leave and there is no debt. Just to say that Deuteronomy 15 verses 12 to 18 also talks about this, and there it says that if the woman is like the man, she's not given as a bride but simply as a debt servant, then she too would go free after 7 years, the same as the man. And what Deuteronomy adds, and this is marvelous, that it's not here, but it is in the parallel passage in Deuteronomy, that after 7 years, when the man or the woman goes free, the person who's had a debt repaid is to be generous and give to these people liberally, so that having paid off their debt, they're able to go rebuild their lives and be productive members of society. If you've worked for 7 years to pay off a debt and you leave with nothing, then you're going to get into debt again. But not in ancient Israel, at least. That's not what God intended. Rather, they would be given to liberally so that they could re-establish their lives and become, as I say, productive members of society. Here we see a distinction in verses 12 to 14 between premeditated murder and accidental death. And because of the custom of the blood feud, a custom which is was in many ancient countries, that is, if a member of your family is killed by someone, you have an obligation as a family member to take their life, a sort of retribution. And that understanding was alive and well, and to bring a protection to people who have may been involved in part of a tragic accident. There were cities of refuge, and these people were able to flee and be protected in these places. But here there's a distinction between premeditated murder and an accident. You can see how these different laws are applications of the Ten Commandments. The one on slavery, an application of do not steal. If you borrow, you need to pay it back. Here, you shall not murder. Here we have violence against family and parents in verse 15, and that was simply not permitted. Whoever strikes father or mother shall be put to death. Honour your father and your mother. People trafficking, we would call this today. Whoever kidnaps a person, whether that person has been sold or is still held in possession, shall be put to death. Normally, if you steal someone's goods, you're not executed. It's not a capital offence. You pay back with interest. But when it is stealing a person, then that was very serious. That was a capital offence. And of course, this is you shall not steal. More about cursing father and mother or honouring your parents. This is verbal violence against parents. So whether it was physical violence in verse 15 or verbal violence, it was not permitted. This honouring of parents, respecting elder people was a really big deal. And then we have laws of compensation, and here we have an example, two people quarrelling, and they didn't have to quarrel, they could have stopped, but the quarrelling ends up being in a fight and someone is injured, no one is killed, but then there's a recovery, and there's simply laws about compensation. If someone hit someone else in this quarrel, then they should pay for full recovery. And so the area of compensation. This has to do with those who would discipline a slave. In other words, there was protection for the slave in verse 20-21 against the extreme punishment. And we have to remember Deuteronomy 23:15 and 16, that if a slave ran away, they were free. They should be protected. They were not required to be sent back to their master. So in ancient Israel, unlike other societies, a slave owner was not free to treat a slave in any way they wanted. There were protections in place. This is an interesting law. It has to do really with the translation of a certain word. In the new RSV, it talks about, in verse 22, when people who are fighting injure a pregnant woman, so there is a miscarriage. Now, that literally means her baby comes out. And there are many that think this is actually talking about a premature birth. And if there is no harm follows, the one responsible shall be fined for whatever the woman's husband demands, paying as much as the judge determines. So it would go to court, and the judge would hear what the husband says, and of course would decide on the price. But if harm follows, i.e. the baby dies, then it's a capital offence. This, I think, shows God's value of unborn life. If the baby dies, it's the death penalty. This little phrase here we have in 25:26, it talks about eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. This is known as lex talionis, and this principle is repeated a few times in the law. And what it is, it's like a proverb talking about how the punishment should fit the crime. It's not taken literally, as I can see, looking at the law, but rather it's a way of saying that the punishment shouldn't be greater than the crime, it shouldn't be less than the crime, but rather the punishment should fit the crime. This here, again, is a protection for the slave, that if the owner strikes a slave, whether it's male or female, notice there's no distinction here with the gender. If they're blinded, then they should let them go free, and likewise if they miss a tooth, they should go free, and in going free, then they can go wherever they want. Now, Deuteronomy does give them that freedom anyway, but this is a protection for the slave, and it is also a message to slave owners, and not to be cruel or abusive to your slaves. We've talked about these next verses when we were looking at how New Covenant believers relate to Old Covenant law. But just to say simply, this is the importance of taking responsibility of dangers that we know of. If there are dangers we're aware of, then we need to take responsibility to protect others, because this is loving our neighbour. Again, this little illustration here of digging a hole, that we should put in reasonable safety measures. Today in our societies we have a lot about health and safety, and this is all about loving our neighbour. We should be taking these things seriously, because these laws here are an expression of God's heart in these areas. Again, giving examples of situations that could be known or not known, accidents that happen that could have been prevented or were simply unexpected. We get good examples here with this ox that hurts another ox. And when you compare it with above, the first examples, a person dies, that's much more serious. Here it has to do with property, and so there's a different take. Animals were a person's wealth. If you had an ox, it would be your tractor, it would plough your field, it would also be other means of wealth. And if someone steals an ox, it is very serious. And if the thief could not pay, they are then sold. And we've talked about debt slavery or debt servitude just earlier. Here we see if a thief is breaking in, that a person has a right to protect their property. Of course, without electricity, if it was at night time and the thief was injured or even killed, it was not the responsibility of the landowner, the house owner. But if it's in the daytime, it was. Just recognizing that in the daytime, the landowner could have done things differently, because property never has the same value as a human life. Here we again see laws that are so related to the farming world. You have your field, you're growing your crops, and then someone else's animals end up in your field and trampling down your crops, and the animals are eating your plants, and what to do. And here in verse 22:5, we see that full restitution should be made from the best of the owner's field or vineyard. We need to take responsibility for what's ours and protect other people's property. Likewise, for a fire breaking out, and the one who starts a fire should make full restitution, taking responsibility for one's actions. If you give someone your money for safekeeping and it's stolen, what do? Was it really stolen? Or have they stolen it themselves and hiding it? And here we have an indication of what should be done. When it says in verse 8 that if the thief is not caught, the owner of the house shall be brought before God, this is another way of talking about them coming to the tabernacle, and then the priest would act as representatives of God, and they would judge and decide this case. And as I've mentioned, the judge's responsibility was to do a thorough research, cross-examination, to gain all the evidence, so they're able to make a just ruling. Again, a very farming, animal-related law. If your animal is given to someone for safekeeping and they dies, then it dies. This is what you should do. Again, it's them coming before God, coming before the judge, and the one whom God condemns shall pay double to the other. This again is talking about coming to the court of law to sort out these kind of problems. There's a distinction here between borrowing and hiring. If someone borrows an animal, and it injures or dies with the owner is not present, then the one who did the borrowing takes responsibility. Full restitution is made. If the owner was present and is there, they are included, and therefore no restitution is made. Well, if the animal was hired, then that's a different arrangement. The person has paid, and if the animal dies, then it's not their responsibility. So again, you can see how in different contexts, the context of the farming agricultural scene, all of these laws would have been so helpful. All circumstances would be different, but the judges would take these as principles and internalize them, and then be able to make rulings that hopefully were just in each unique situation. Here we have the laws regarding the social side of life. If a man seduces a virgin who is not engaged to be married and lies with her, then he shall pay the bride price and make her his wife. Now, we read that the bride price is in Deuteronomy, actually. This is repeated in Deuteronomy, this law, Deuteronomy 22. And the bride price is 6 to 8 years' salary. And so it was a lot. Normally, a bride price was negotiated by the man and the father. But if he had already lain with the woman and they had to get married, how do you then decide a bride price? Well, that's been decided in Deuteronomy. It was between 6 to 8 years' salary. We have to also understand that in the culture, if a young woman was not a virgin on her wedding night, then her chances of being married were very, very slim. And therefore, if a man does this in seducing a virgin, then these were how things should work out. Now, of course, the woman might not want to marry the man. If that's the case, we read here, but if the father refuses to give her to him, then he shall pay the amount equal to the bride price for virgins. In other words, he has to pay either way. And there's no forced marriage going on here. When you read Deuteronomy, it could look like it's a forced marriage, but it's not a forced marriage. This is something that will be decided between the woman and the father. You shall not permit a female sorcerer to live. This is dealing with the occult, a very serious thing and very much part of idolatry. This is a law against sexual perversion in verse 19. This, incidentally, was part of Canaanite worship at times, having sexual intercourse with animals, and that was a serious offence. And in verse 20, against idolatry. And so these laws really are about having no other gods before me. I've mentioned elsewhere that idolatry was like a cancer. Getting involved with that for Israel was like somebody today contracting cancer. Very serious. And you deal with cancer in whatever way, whatever it takes, you deal with it, as we know today. And here we see very strong statements against idolatry. Here we have some verses about protecting the most vulnerable in society. You do not wrong or oppress a resident alien. You do not abuse an orphan or a widow. And notice, if you do these things, I will hear their cry, verse 24, and my wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword. Your wives will become widows and your children orphans. We've talked elsewhere about the anger of God. God is a God of justice. His anger, his justice is part of his love. And when vulnerable people are exploited, that matters to him. And as we will see, as the story of Israel unfolds, this actually happens, where after repeated warnings, the people did not turn from their oppression of the vulnerable and idolatry, and indeed they did. They were attacked by the sword, and just as predicted here, that their wives and widows became orphans. If you lend money to my people, verse 25, and to the poor, you shall not deal with them as creditors. You shall not extract interest from them. Here we have protection for the poor, to keep their dignity, that the poor should not be exploited. Taking interest on a loan was prohibited in Israel when money was being loaned to another Israelite. And even if you take a protection for your loan, if you take their cloak, then you should give it back to them, because that may be the only covering they have. And how can a person sleep when it gets so cold? And it can get really cold, as you may know, in this part of the world at night. And so here you see the heart of compassion that God is saying when it comes to the poor and the needy. Compassion is the key thing that should be happening. Lend to them generously, do not treat them as creditors, and protect them. Verse 28 is against blasphemy and also honouring leaders above us. Both things that is lacking, incredibly lacking today. Here it talks about a heart of generosity. You shall not delay in making offerings from the fullness of your harvest and from the outflow of your presses. The offering was required. It was part of the tax, the 10% tax. We call it a tithe today, but it was the tax on the people to enable the tabernacle to function, so the priests could do their job, and they would have what's necessary in the tabernacle to do the various offerings. And here, very simply, do not delay. I don't think there is any system to make people give. People had to give out of their own heart, as a heart of generosity. And we have here about the laws of the firstborn. This, of course, the firstborn belonging to the Lord was a part of the Exodus thing. The firstborn of Israel were protected, but they belonged to the Lord. And all of this is worked out in great detail in Numbers 3, because the tribe of Levi ends up becoming the equivalent to the firstborn. Each of the different tribes, the firstborn sons, were redeemed, and the tribe of Levi took that place. 31, you shall be a people consecrated to me, therefore you shall not eat any meat that is mangled by beasts in the field, you shall throw it to the dogs. Watch what you eat. I guess today, as it says on the screen, don't eat roadkill. What you eat matters, and of course in Leviticus there's going to be far more detailed laws about what should and shouldn't be eaten. A lot here about malicious witnesses. Again, the commandment, you shall not bear false witness. The law courts, integrity of the law court system is really important. And you see here the particular temptations, joining in the hands of the wicked to give a false witness, or following the majority, trying to be part of the herd in the way you represent things, or even being partial to the poor. No, God really does care for the poor. But when it comes to the law court system, justice doesn't deviate to the poor or the rich. It doesn't deviate to the great or the small, to male or female. Justice is justice. And you give an honest witness is what is being called for. The importance of the law court. If you find your enemy's ox, it doesn't matter if they're your enemy or not, you give it back to them. This is the simple statement we read, I believe it's in Leviticus, of even loving your enemies. And if your donkey, your enemy's donkey, overloaded, falls over, very hard to get up, again, you love your enemy, but even more, you care for the animal, so that the animal is able to get up under its burden. A law about not perverting justice, verse 6 of 23, all the way through verse 8. You shall not pervert justice due to the poor in their lawsuits. Keep far from false charges and do not kill the innocent and those in the right. This was really important. God wanted his people to have a justice system where justice was blind. It was absolutely down the road. Very, very important. Do not exploit the foreigner. Notice it says, for you were aliens in Egypt. You know what it's like to be foreigners. So respect and protect the foreigner that comes into your land. Here we have a law about how the land should have rest every 7 years. And so you sow for 6 and then you let the land lie fallow, presumably so the land can rejuvenate. This is before fertilizers and these kind of things. And this is worked out in great detail in Leviticus chapter 25. Again, a exhortation to keep the Sabbath in 23:12 to 13. Only the emphasis this time is that there would be rest, and it is so your working animals may have relief, and your homeborn slaves, and the resident alien that may be working for you, so they now are included in the Sabbath. In other words, the Sabbath was for everybody and not just for the wealthy landowners. And the purpose was to give rest. Warnings against idolatry, how they are absolutely free from it, that they do not use the name of the gods. They don't even speak them out. Again, let me say, idolatry for Israel was like a cancer. And as we look at Kings together, we're going to see how awful it was. And so idolatry needed extreme means to keep the people free from it. Then it's just a bit about the festivals that became the agricultural calendar and also the worship calendar for Israel. Passover, Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. These are the 3 times God wanted Israel to unite. Israel was decentralized. The system of government was not centralized, it was decentralized. The tribes had all of their own tribal elders. But the thing that held Israel together were the worship celebrations at the different key harvest points of the year, when they would gather together and celebrate the giving of the law, the Passover first, and then Pentecost, the giving of the law, and then the Feast of Tabernacles, where they celebrated God's provision and protection in the wilderness. And so each of the big agricultural moments, and remember they were agricultural people, the big agricultural moments were connected to celebrate the goodness of God in their history. And then a little bit about the sacrifices. All of this is going to be expanded in Leviticus. They were not to have leavened bread in their worship sacrifices, or to eat the fat. This is verse 18. And also to keep from the blood. And then the first fruits, give God the best, the choicest, and remember him first. This little law at the end of verse 19 has caused lots of people to wonder. You shall not boil a kid in a mother's milk. But this seems to be a Canaanite practice. There was a poem, or a fragment of a poem, found in archaeology, and these words were identified: cook a kid in the milk, a lamb in the cream. And so it seems that this strange law is simply a prohibition against a common Canaanite practice. It's actually repeated a few times in the law, you will notice. And then about how God was going to bring them into the land. And I just want you to notice the emphasis here. The emphasis is the angel going before them, and how God will give them the land. But notice the emphasis is actually not so much killing, but driving them out, or the Canaanites being displaced. Of course, when armies came against Israel, the armies would fight, but here the emphasis is that the Canaanites would be driven out. The gods, they were of the Canaanites, there's a lot said about how they should not bow down to them, worship them, but they should be utterly demolished and broken in pieces. Tremendous warnings about those kind of things, but mostly that the enemies will be driven out.